to the home, it's about connection to your farm building, to your hog barn, and why that is important, to the overall functionality and economic health of a community is really important. And it's, again, elevating those state perspectives for those folks who are experiencing and living this every day, which really varies across the country. So that's the first step, and then I'll let Anna share specifically what states are doing with data and mapping.
I think we see basically three categories of what states are doing with data and mapping. The first is the no mapping approach, which you see in Virginia, where they've decided essentially a conversation with a local government or a county commissioner can give you a better sense of what the situation on the ground is than trying to work with the existing data.
Can I stop you just a second with Virginia? So Microsoft is doing its white spaces initiative, as I understand it, Southwest Virginia, Roanoke area. Is that as a response to the approach they're taking, or is that something they chose that area independently? I'm kind of fuzzy on what that's about.
I think it's independent.
It's independent.
Yeah.
It's independent. The Airband initiative, they selected their criteria, or they selected their rollout areas based on a series of criteria, some of which were related to business opportunities for Microsoft. And Roanoke has a pretty robust eds and meds economy, and I think that's part of the rollout strategy, but it was independent of that effort.
Nothing altruistic about it. I'll just stop there. I'm sorry, that's an editorial, forgive me.
And then you have the approach that Tennessee is taking, which is essentially a verification approach. So they aren't doing a full-scale mapping of the state, but they do map the areas that are eligible for grants, and then companies applying for the grants have to provide evidence that the area is unserved in order to be eligible. And if there's question about that, they do send out a third-party contractor to do mapping and data collection work in that area to determine the eligibility of it.
Who coordinates that in Tennessee?
The Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development is the state agency responsible for their grant program. And then you have the states that are doing more full-scale mapping, which include Minnesota, Colorado, and Wisconsin. Most of them do, to some extent, still rely on the FCC 477 data. Sometimes they try to collect it on a more updated cycle so that they can publish a more updated map. And Colorado does use a different, it's like the public lands grid system, as opposed to the census block to display that data for the state.
Okay, so please explain census block.
Census block is a geographic indicator that's used to, covers,
A census block is a geographic unit that's used by the census for data collection purposes. It's a small, it's basically the smallest unit that's available. And so one of the challenges that exists with it is the size of a census block differs greatly across areas because they capture roughly the same amount of population. And so in urban areas, they can be very small, and in rural areas, they can be very large.
I just looked at a census block map within the last 2 weeks that identified about 90% of Southwest Missouri is covered. It isn't. So we know the SEC's methodology is not anything of beauty, and we struggle with that. We have DD shaking their head.
We're working on that. Tim's very aware of that specific block, and he's been working with the providers to narrow that down and try to get better data.
It's something that we struggle with mightily here in Missouri because we know what the hierarchy of needs is, we just don't know who they are yet. And it's a real problem for the local area. Sorry, I keep interrupting.
That's okay.
You should agree with that. Okay, thank you.
Would it be helpful if we covered what the FCC actually gathers with their data collection process?
That'd be great.
Okay. So the FCC collects twice a year information on what's called the Form 477, and what they do is they ask providers across the country to fill out or to note every census block where they could or could reasonably, where they currently provide or could reasonably provide service to at least one address in that census block. So in some cases, that is a census block that is the size of a city block. In other cases, that is a census block that is hundreds of miles wide. And again, it's where they currently provide service or where they could reasonably provide service to at least one address.
Can I ask a really dumb question?
There are no dumb questions.
Okay. Census block, in layman's terms, what is that? Is it just a block of, like, a town? Can that be a census block? Can a region be a census block? I mean, what's that?
So it's, it is generally smaller than either a town or a region. It's essentially just a tract that's divided. It's don't quote me on this because I think I have the number wrong, but it's generally an area that contains about 8,000 people.
So it's based on population density, not on geographic boundaries.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a census block could overlap multiple, like town or county boundaries.
And there are tens of thousands across the country, which is part of the challenge. And the data that's provided to the FCC at this point goes through a rather light verification process. And people are humans fill out these forms. So mistakes happen, and then there's a light verification process. That information gets put together and then uploaded into what was formerly called the National Broadband Map. I think it's currently called the Broadband Availability Map. And again, that FCC data is what most folks, that informs billions of dollars in federal funding each year. So that when a provider says that they are offering service or could offer service to that census block is considered served, and then therefore is not eligible for various types of funding, which is why states.
How many census blocks do we have in Missouri?
That's a good question. I can get back to you on that. I do not know.
I have a map at the Broadband office of census blocks and coverage.
Oh.
Since it's informal, if you don't, I can bring my phone up and show.
If you wouldn't mind going ahead and emailing that to us.
This is Kennedy. I have a question. That means if there's a hospital which may have really good broadband, then everything around them can be considered served and not actually be served? That's what you're telling me, correct?
Yeah, let me double check that because there are some differences between collecting data on residential addresses, small businesses, and then community anchor institutions such as hospitals. But we can get back to you on that, sir.
To Representative Hayden's point, the same thing would apply for libraries and schools. We have something called MoreNet in Missouri. It basically connects our academic libraries, public libraries, schools, and that's something that network continues to build out. There's still some school buildings in Missouri that don't have that access yet. We're working on it, but that's another point. The roughly 8,000 population, certain areas of the state, that's 2 counties,
Right.
literally. I have one in my district that they've done that to, 6,000 people, they're all covered. No, they're not. Because they have a couple of municipalities that are well covered, but they basically paint everybody with the same brush and say you're all in. No, they're not.
In your mapping discussion over the summer, did y'all talk about mapping community anchor institutions as well?
To my knowledge, no.
Alright, we'll pull that verification information for you.
So Louis, what you're saying is if you got some people, they'd be considered coverage, so they couldn't get any more grant, and the rest of the county really isn't covered. That's what you're saying, correct?
Absolutely.
Well, that's my understanding. Like in Mexico, we would have pretty good coverage, but the rest of the county does not.
And it won't. And according to the census block methodology, they check the box, you are, and you're not.
What's that?
They check the box that you are, but you're not.
Well, that's what I'm getting at, is that we are, and a lot of Callaway is leaving.
Okay. And ask you a question about Minnesota, and we've tracked Minnesota very carefully, and actually pattern a lot of what we do here on what they've been able to accomplish. You mentioned an informal effort there as well as the state-based. Can you go into a little more detail about how that works?
Sure. So the Minnesota Rural Broadband Coalition is a coalition of rural partners, essentially, that works to advocate for the Office of Broadband Development and the Border to Border Grant Fund. The coalition originated at a conference hosted by the Blandon Foundation, which is a very important partner in broadband development in Minnesota. They have been engaged since around the mid-2000s in supporting communities. They're focused on rural Minnesota and strengthening rural Minnesota communities, and broadband is one of the major issues that they focus on. And they provided initial funding for the coalition and have been a partner for that. The coalition has grown and now employs one full-time lobbyist as well as a number of volunteers, and works actively at the state capitol, again, to support funding the fund, is what they like to say, and keeping the Office of Broadband Development active.
And Anna talked a little bit earlier both about the importance of stakeholder engagement and also about local capacity planning. The Blandon Foundation is one of the community foundations that is pioneering that. So what they are doing is stepping in to help communities prepare for applying for grants from the state, understand sort of what they need, what their challenges may be, what some realistic solutions can be on the ground, and build that expertise to help communities and providers build what they refer to as the community provider relationship rather than the public-private partnership. We get a lot of questions about the role that other organizations can play in kind of helping support state efforts in achieving whatever their broadband goal is. This is where community foundations seem to be playing a really big role.
And what would the average stakeholder look like in that organization?
So we actually were able to attend their Minnesota Rural Broadband Coalition Day on the Hill in April, and the stakeholders included people who work on broadband, like small providers. They included like consultants who work on economic development, rural economic development and broadband. They included a lot of community stakeholders, county commissioners, and others who, and you can see a full list of their official members on the Minnesota Rural Broadband Coalition website.
They lobby in DC as well as
No.
just in St. Paul?
Yeah.
And when they are training people, they are training your average citizen in the state. It is sometimes these consultants and your local economic development leaders, but it is also a woman who runs a post office and a general store on an island in Maine. It's these people that, often in the community you hear them referred to as the broadband champion. It's really that person who picks up that flag for the community and says, we need this for our survival. And this is increasingly what the language is turning to, is that our communities will not survive unless we have this connection. So you have people who feel very passionately about this and who are building coalitions and then taking it upon themselves to build that expertise in order to figure out what will work best for their community. And community foundations, and in some cases state programs, are very effective partners in getting that done.
And Maine also does have a rural broadband coalition too that
Yes.
is engaged in similar efforts.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit also about Minnesota and their public-private partnership. So from my understanding, they actually enable LLCs to be created. They have areas which basically mirror what we have in the Ozarks, Southwest Missouri in particular, as far as difficulty of terrain. And I think I've heard that it's like the second hardest mineral in the world is located in parts of Southwest Minnesota, so they're boring through this. What is that? First of all, legislation on that, was it a problem to get that passed to your knowledge? And second, how has that worked?
The legislation for the grant program?
Yes.
I think we would point you towards Matt Schmidt,
Yes.
who is now the broadband director for the state of Illinois and was the state legislator who really moved that forward. He is a vocal advocate for broadband, and I think we heard that there were some challenges in the process, but there was general bipartisan support for the issue.
I think the thing, and I think to Anna's point, Matt Schmidt would be a fantastic resource for you to connect with. And then there's also another legislator that I would connect you with in West Virginia named Bob Plymale. But what is unique, or not unique, but unique, both to West Virginia and Minnesota and a number of other states, is that they have a very engaged and educated legislature who is coming together really to be champions and leaders and partners in advancing these broadband priorities and programs.
And then we'll direct your attention now to Tennessee. You mentioned their initiatives built out around the state library. How does that work?
So the state library is a partner with TNECD in the initiative. A portion of the funding that's appropriated to TNECD for the grant programs goes to the State Library and Archives to support digital literacy and adoption training. And the state they've seen that as a very important component of the grant program because it helps improve adoption rates once the state has invested in infrastructure. So Tennessee has some of the lowest adoption rates in the country for a number of reasons, and they have recognized that as a challenge and a need in order to make their infrastructure projects successful, and for relatively low cost compared to infrastructure, they're seeing high impact results
So
with investment in those
basically,
programs.
they would use the libraries themselves as hubs, in fact.
Yeah, so the libraries provide different types of trainings on all kinds of things, and they have several different programs, both the ones supported by the Tennessee Broadband Accessibility Act grants, and then the state libraries has been engaged, obviously, in digital literacy efforts for a while. And the libraries provide, very basic how to get online, how to use your email, to more advanced trainings.
So this would be for the general populace, not say an after-school program.
Right.
Okay. In North Carolina, and so we have some materials on them, but nothing within the last 2 years, I believe. Are they on pace? You mentioned they have a deadline or goal, 2021. Are they on pace to meet their goals?
I think we can certainly get back to you on that, and we can direct you to the team in North Carolina as well. We can get back to you on that and how they're making progress towards their goal, but also how they're measuring progress towards their
That's
goal.
my next question,
Yeah.
is what metrics are they using?
Do you want to walk through Minnesota's? Yeah, but, or Tennessee, or?
Yeah, so North Carolina has that goal in their plan. They've just recently established a grant program, the GREAT grant program, to provide funding for unserved areas in Tier 1 counties, which are their economically distressed counties in the state. And so they're starting to, for the first time, provide state funding towards that, though the state has had a very active effort for a number of years, focused again on technical assistance, homework app, etc. Minnesota obviously has its goal established in statute, the 25.3 by 2022, 100 megabits per second, 20 megabits per second by 2026. And they're working towards that, and they continue to measure progress, and they make a report to the legislature every year on the progress that's been made, the number of homes, businesses, and community anchor institutions connected through the grant program, the number of households served at each speed, or the percentage of Minnesotans served at each speed, and the rural-urban divide in that.
Okay, and a follow-up question, as far as states themselves, are you or anybody else measuring lack of economic activity where there is no broadband?
Take a first swing at that.
We've looked extensively at the literature on that. There have been efforts to measure it, and a lot of them focus on kind of an earlier time period, kind of the rollout of broadband technology. And then there are efforts that are kind of location specific. There's a team in Indiana that does great work on those impacts in Indiana specifically at Purdue. The results are somewhat mixed when you're just looking at the presence of a connection. When you look at both broadband connection and adoption of the technology, adoption and use, they're positive. We are not specifically doing any economic analysis.
No. But the stakeholders in our interviews really emphasize the local impact of projects and how the impact of that grant funding is truly felt within their communities. But the question that we're starting to explore now is not what happens when you have a connection, but what happens when you don't have a connection, which is the question that keeps coming up is what is the opportunity cost for our community by not having this broadband here?
And that's one thing, talking about educating fellow legislators, we've got those numbers, and they would be staggering, I'm sure, in the billions. But to be able to have that metric, to be able to say, here's what we missed out on the last 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years, would be a real help. And if there are any resources out there to track that, I'd really appreciate it.
Mhm.
And the companion question to that is anybody tracking the assessed valuation where we have before and after photos, as it were, broadband access not? That would include fiber, fixed wireless, all forms basically, that would get us to 25.3 from wherever it is. So, just anecdotally talking to realtors in my area, assessed valuation, add fiber to the home, the range is $3,000 to $5,000 per parcel. And that's something we can verify that through the assessors. But that's what I'm getting from realtors anecdotally. Is anybody tracking that at the statewide or other levels that we can take a look and say, here's what this means to you as a tax base within your county, your roads, your bridges, your schools?
The Fiber to the Home Council has done some work on that. Obviously, there is a focus there. We've also heard, again, anecdotally across multiple states that realtors are citing that and citing the increased value of homes that do have fiber connections. And we also heard about homes specifically being advertised like with
Well, that's the other side of it. I'm being told by realtors if it doesn't have the fiber or similar, connection, they're not selling them. There they said. So.
I think that this is something that we've heard come up more and more in the last year, really. And as Anna noted, there was a study done by Fiber to the Home out of Carnegie Mellon University. We can send that to you as well. It's a couple years old now, but it was in that $3,000 to $5,000 range. But it's something that we are starting to think through, and how would we be able to actually quantify that? And if you're, what's the actual impact? Again, it comes back to that opportunity cost and what are we missing out on by not having these connections present in the
And the
community.
reason I bring it up in terms of education, we have some counties where gravel is considered to be a virtue. And of course, we have populations, the northern tier counties in Missouri are losing populations, the young people. The old people stay put, they die. They're not replenished basically by the young people who leave. We can't educate from a place because we don't have the broadband capabilities we've already talked about. And basically, we've got counties that are, I would say, borderline in crisis. But trying to explain to folks that, yeah, you absolutely positively need this is a harder sell than it should be, because there are expenses associated with rolling it out. We'll have a guest this afternoon who'll talk much more about that, because that's what he's doing every day. But I'm just trying to figure out if there's data out there, hard numbers to demonstrate now what this economic picture looks like. I mean, anecdotal takes us so far, but the metrics need to be fact-based.
Yeah, I think Anna pointed earlier, or noted earlier, that the literature on this is mixed, specifically when you're talking about just the presence of a connection. But I think more and more we're trying to see where the conversation is moving away from what can broadband contribute to the GDP, what's my ROI on this, and into, again, these things that you just outlined. But not to be self-serving, but this is why more research on the subject is needed. But why it's also really important for us to have these conversations with legislators to understand, what are you losing from your communities by not having it? Is this population? Is it opportunities for business? What is it that y'all are missing out on? So getting your perspective on what would be helpful to measure or to evaluate would be really helpful.
I'm just telling you, from talking to people in my district, we're missing out on entrepreneurs, people who want to stay home with their children because daycare is an issue due to distance or availability of daycare. They want to be able to stand up a business at their home. They don't have the bandwidth to have a website. If they have a website, they don't have the bandwidth or at certain times of the day to actually be selling product, order fulfillment, that type of thing. I've talked to people who are in this boat. They're in their 30s. This is what they want to do, but because of where they live, it's impossible, so they're going to move. We don't need that in rural areas. We need them to stay, bring the capability out to them. Another aspect is, you mentioned the homework gap, so we have students who basically aren't getting as much homework because we know they have the tablets are only as good as their usage points, which is in the school, so they don't assign as much homework as they normally would, so they can get it done before they leave. In Missouri, we're not equipping buses as Wi-Fi hotspots, and I rode the country bus. We didn't do any work on the bus anyway. That was not realistic, but other states have moved in that direction. So I mean, that's a Band-Aid. We're looking for a tourniquet. You know, we've got to stop this bleeding, and we're hemorrhaging people, and it's because they don't have access to that 21st century amenity that other folks have. And the number one problem, the rural-urban divide right now is basically the technology divide. And we know that in Missouri. Companion question, we talk about we're 41st in access, we're also 49th in speed. So if there's any studies out there that also quantify what happens when your speeds aren't what they're supposed to be, and I'm not going to get into the politics of advertised rates versus actual, that's a different conversation. But we're also up against that while we're at it. It's not just the access, what we do have isn't sufficient for where we are. So I'm just wondering if anybody else is tracking that.
Sort of. But the other thing is not, more and more state legislators are talking about those issues that you just outlined. It's about the access, it's about the access to technology to be able to use it. It's about the speed that you're getting, but it's also about the reliability of that speed and whether or not you can trust that it will be what it is supposed to be when you need it. And also about the affordability of that as well. There are just a couple of states that are really starting to wrap their arms around the issue, but most of the states that we spoke to are seriously thinking about how to address those things, because if the connection is there.
Which states are wrapping around?
Tennessee, North Carolina, and California.
California.
Yeah. California is probably the one that's thinking the most ahead about this idea of digital equity and kind of what that means for the state and how they want to go about actually encouraging digital equity and access.
And Tennessee does include considerations of affordability in their grant scoring.
I'm sorry to keep interrupting you.
No, it's okay.
Y'all are doing real well, so I'll pick your brains while you're here.
That's why we're here.
Next question is related to telemedicine. So Missouri authorized patients sitting at home as end users 2016. It took a couple of years to get the policies and procedures in place to do that. I visited with a constituent within the last 30 days who was trying to access telemedicine resources from her home. She's outside the fiber ring. She has limited service. Her husband is housebound. They get him out with very great difficulty. He only goes out to doctor's appointments. The whole idea between telehealth is they don't have to go to the doctor's appointment. The doctor comes to them. And their service is spotty enough that he's not able to do that consistently. So is anybody out there measuring what that relates to in terms of transportation costs and also quality of life issues, folks who should have it, who don't, having to basically pick up and go places they otherwise would not have to go. And that goes to cold and flu season as well.
So there's definitely a lot of conversation about that and the impacts of telehealth opportunities on travel. The state that we talked to specifically about the actual cost of transport and the impacts of that on state budgets is Virginia, and they are looking at how increasing telehealth could cut down on the amount the state pays to transport people to and from medical appointments. And so that's definitely a consideration of how they're looking at that issue.
Is anybody taking a look at that holistically as far as a quality of life issue, life expectancy? We know the closer people are to home, the better they heal. That's rural hospitals, but you heal even better if you're in your own house.
I think we can get back to you on that.
Yeah. We can certainly get back to you on that, and I will note that the Brookings Institute, Brookings is working on a study right now about what access to digital skills can do for quality of life, or digital tools and access. It's essentially digital equity and what it does to quality of life. And health impact assessments are certainly one of those things. So they're in the process of rolling out that research, so we can send you the information that they have, and also send you some information on health impact evaluations.
And I was gonna ask a more general question. What steps can the state take to ensure that speeds are appropriate to the need of businesses? We talked about telehealth delivery of state services themselves. Are any states looking at that as far as quality of their own services?
In our conversations with states, we primarily focus on their grant programs and the last mile connectivity to homes and businesses. In terms of delivery of state services, it's certainly something that states are doing, but it's generally a separate conversation. We did talk with at least one CIO's office about that being, a challenge for remote and field offices, and how these challenges are not completely distinct, but states are generally focusing on sort of their state networks or their state field offices, and connecting those is a separate challenge than the residential.
And I'll give you a real quick example. Our unemployment hearing appeals officers use basically Skype from, we call them now, we used to call them unemployment offices, now they're job training offices or whatever we call them. That's fine. They literally can sit at their desk or a courtroom, wherever in Jefferson City, and Skype that out to the entire rest of the state, as opposed to having to do windshield time going back and forth. This time they're not working on their cases, their decisions themselves, expenses for overnight stays, and on it goes. By the same time, we have the workers' compensation judges who aren't doing that at all. And I'm looking at this as a cost saving where they don't have to be sitting in front of whomever claimants unless it's a trial or some sort of other proceeding, which is rare. And looking at basically to compare the cost savings between one or two, they're within the same department. So I'm just trying to figure out if states have any sort of metrics that they are employing to look at within their own state governments to evaluate their own broadband capabilities, their own strategies.
Let us look into that a little bit more. It's a very good question.
Thank you. I was going to ask a more general question as well. What do you foresee as emerging trends at the national, state, and then local levels? And before I finish the question, we hear about low-level satellites. They're going to solve all our problems. Thank you, Elon Musk. How realistic are these solutions?
Okay. Well, taking the technology question first, we, like many states across the country, are tech neutral in the way that we're looking at this research. And satellites may be a part of the solution at some point. And as maybe 5G, robust wireless, and of course wired connections. It is about the combination of technologies that you need in order to make sure that folks are online. We are not satellite experts. We're happy to connect you with folks who are, who may be able to speak to that question in more detail about Elon Musk or others. But I think the important thing is that these connections, whether you're talking specifically about wireless or 5G, it's just one wire less, right? They all need a robust fiber connection to work. So they all rely on that backbone in order to provide a good, useful connection. But there are a couple of key trends that I would flag for you. First is that more states are doing more, and really what that means is that states are not just enacting policies to increase deployment, they're also putting funds and resources towards supporting those efforts, so money and people in order to get it done. The second, as Anna noted, states are tying broadband to other policy priorities such as agriculture, education, and healthcare. So Anna went over how that opens additional routes for funding, but what it also does is that it ties that connection to these efforts. So often we have folks ask, well, telehealth is going to solve all this stuff. It's going to solve the opioids crisis. It may be part of that solution, but if you don't have those connections, those reliable connections in order to provide that telehealth service, then telehealth cannot be a part of that solution. You have to have broadband. The third piece is that states are setting up grant programs across the country, again, getting back to that policy and resources piece, and they are by and large focusing on connecting homes and businesses, small businesses in particular. fourth and finally, and I've touched on this a little bit already, but again, states are now starting to think through whether or not folks have the skills to use the networks that they're supporting, that public dollars are supporting. Second, whether or not those connections are reliable. And then third, whether or not those connections are affordable for folks. And, you know, ultimately, as we've heard from a number of people, this really does come down to an economic decision. But the reliability piece, the quality piece of that connection really does inform that economic decision as well.
And we're gonna talk a little more about take rates, where we'll have somebody in at 1 o'clock. But you noticed, research, 71% take rate, rural areas, 79% not rural. Are states looking at ways to educate folks to the need for this? I know folks who think of broadband is, I check my email and my grandkids' Facebook account. It's so much more than that, but our states literally staffing up to go out and have people basically train other people on the need for this.
Yeah, so again, Tennessee is an example of that, and there are kind of two components of that. The first is what we've mentioned with the partnership with the State Library and Archives, and the second is that they include community support as a component of scoring in their grant application, and what that involves is providers actively demonstrating that there's support from the community for a project by gathering testimonials, videos, other sorts of evidence that the community is enthusiastic about the project, and they found that engagement on the front end helps take rates once the project is completed.
And they verified that. I mean, that's hard data.
They're still fairly early in their grant program, so this is the third year of it, so there is not a lot of data on that at this point, but that is the working theory.
And research has pretty much so uniformly confirmed that awareness piece, building awareness about broadband, not only about the present, that hey, a connection is coming, but also this is why it's relevant to your life. It is relevant for you to be able to check your kids, your grandkids' Facebook account, but it also means that you can connect to your Social Security benefits. It also means, and they can go through that whole list. It means a farmer can not only, you know, have a connection to check on their cows, but also to be able to use that herd management software. Or, you know, you asked earlier about state, you know, how state governments are using this. As more and more of the regulatory activity is going online, people have to upload that. Folks need to actually know how to use the technology to be able to use
Most
it.
of your job applications now have an online component.
Well, you can't even apply to McDonald's without a
Without.
connection. But this is again where if it's not coming from the state, that awareness and that digital literacy training piece, even the technology, access to technology piece, that's where your external organizations can play a role in helping be partners with the state in advancing those efforts. So whether you're talking about a community foundation or an organization that repurposes or refurbishes technology, that's where those organizations can, you know, really build a strong base of support and partnership with state efforts.
Where would we find, they have research available on that?
We can send it to you.
Missouri's appropriated $5 million for broadband expansion. We have an office in place. We've enacted our minimum standards, 25.3, which is the federal level. What next steps are other states taking to roll out broadband aggressively? I see Illinois is going to appropriate $400 million plus. That's taking a sledgehammer to it. We're a balanced budget state. That's not going to happen for us. So are there other strategies that states use that aren't cash rich, but not cash strapped? We're talking basically middle of the road type approach that are able to get this deployment out sooner rather than later.
So we've seen several states sort of grow the funding of their grant programs over time. So Virginia had 2 years of $1 million in their grant body grant program, and then a year of $4 million, and this year they have $19 million. Wisconsin had $20 million over a 5-year period. The last 2 years of that were $7 million each, and has now $48 million over the next biennium. So the sort of making progress, demonstrating progress, and growing support for the funding program. We've also seen states, Catherine mentioned West Virginia, that does not have any state funding available at this point, has taken a really aggressive approach to evaluating its policy, where there might be barriers that exist, and just every year sort of adjusting things that they think will help improve the landscape for broadband deployment in the state. And then, you know, we've seen, or we've heard through our research that there's definitely benefits to making aggressive investments in it, but there can be benefits to sort of allowing, knowing that there's certainty in having funding for coming years, in the ability for providers to plan and phase their projects.
Along with that, are states ranking various types of services? So are they actually scoring things higher if they're talking fiber to the home versus fixed wireless versus white space? I'm just trying to get a handle on what other states are doing to get this out effectively.
So most of the grant programs are technology neutral towards fixed wireless and wireline technologies, though they do have, as is outlined in Missouri statute as well, you know, the speed requirements for minimum speeds and the ability to upgrade the technology to higher speeds, or prioritizing technology that can be upgraded to higher speeds.
All right, so we know fiber to the home is easy, that's future proof. What about our wireless capability to upgrade that? What does that take in terms of effort and money?
We're not technical experts on that, but we can provide you some additional information on like how Minnesota's scoring program incorporates that.
Talking to providers, literally if there's a mature tree waving, depending on the type of wind, wireless connection goes south in a hurry.
Pine needles in North Carolina.
We've heard pine needles in view.
Pine needles.
Pine needles.
Hadn't heard that one yet.
But they figured out that was the problem.
I was going to ask, and this will probably be the last question, so thank you for your patience. Unless Ken has one, are there any states regulating broadband internet as a utility per se?
Across our research, we've not found any states that are regulating broadband as a utility. We do see states where the Public Utilities Commission or Public Service Commission is engaged with broadband, and generally those are states where the universal service or high cost support mechanism has been repurposed to support their broadband grant program.
Can you define engaged?
Generally they are, so for example, in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Broadband Office is housed within the Public Service Commission and administers the broadband grants for the state. In California, the California Public Utilities Commission administers the California Advanced Services Fund, which has 4 sub-accounts dedicated to broadband, one for infrastructure, one for adoption, one for public housing accounts, and one for line extension projects to help get that connection, you know, up a driveway to somebody's home. Because that can be a challenge, is that you're on the line, but you're not,
On the line.
you're too far for them to be required to extend it. And then Colorado, which is a slightly more complicated structure, but we'd be happy to explain that further.
And that actually led to 2 more questions, so I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's why we're here.
Second, basically last mile access. We hear the folks who are at the very end of the country road. They really want the service. A lot of them are elderly. Telehealth comes into play again. What are states doing basically to bridge that particular gap, or are they? I mean, that's an economic decision. It's going to cost people dearly. Are they subsidizing that? I mean,